We have an amazing event planned for you this evening, Nurse Engineers Building What Healthcare Really Needs. And at this time is my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest presenters. We have Dr. Nancy Downing, Dr. Karen Giuliano, and Dr. Daniel Orther. Nancy is an associate professor at the Center of Excellence in Forensic Nursing at Texas A&M. She teaches in the MSN Forensic Nursing program and conducts research on the intersections of interpersonal violence, substance use, and trauma and related health outcomes. Many of her state and federally funded projects utilize technology as a tool to address issues related to access to care and the potential for technology to mitigate or prevent adverse health outcomes associated with violence, trauma, and abuse. She is a member of the ANA Innovation Advisory Committee, vice chair of the NIST OSAC Forensic Nursing Subcommittee, former president of the International Association of Forensic Nurses, and a member of the Texas Forensic Science Commission. In 2019, she was inducted as a fellow into the American Academy of Nursing. Karen is the co-director of the Elaine Marieb Center for Nursing and Engineering Innovation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. With a clinical background in critical care and 25 plus years global experience in the development of new medical products, Karen's focus is to improve the delivery of care for nurses and the experience of care for patients and family. Her expertise includes human-centered design and clinical outcomes research. Karen actively contributes to many professional organizations and works with small, medium, and large companies on medical product development and innovation. Karen really enjoys working with frontline caregivers to support research at the point of care. Karen is a fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, a Six Sigma Green Belt, holds a BSN and PhD in nursing from Boston College, and completed a postdoctoral research fellowship on IV infusion device safety at Yale University. Daniel is an internationally renowned for leadership bridging engineers, nurses, and sanitarians to advance environmental health practice through science diplomacy. His passions include environmental issues, both built and natural, with expertise in biotechnology and sustainable development. He enjoys a demonstrated track record of success in promoting access to water, sanitation and hygiene, food and nutrition security, energy efficiency, and innovation to alleviate extreme poverty. Daniel's approach to problem aims to incorporate the 5 Ps: planet, people, prosperity, partnerships, and peace to meet the needs of today without compromising the future. He iterates design thinking and the scientific method to build up solution and break down problems employing empathy, creativity, and rationality. Welcome all. At this time, we'll have Nancy go ahead with her presentation.
All right, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. I think they threw me in there, hopefully to inspire you. I'm despite all those credentials and things that I do, I'm really just a nurse. Not just a nurse, but I'm a super nurse like all of you, and you all can be a part of this innovation journey. I'm not even young and I can do this. So I think I'm hopefully going to convince you and inspire you through this presentation. So next slide, please. Oh, yes. Okay, so this is something that I learned from being a part of the ANA innovation work. And it's very interesting to me that although it looks pretty impressive, 42 nurses responsible for 94 inventions, but that's over, a couple hundred years here almost. And when you compare that there's been almost 6,000 medical device patents awarded in the last, I don't know, my math is terrible. I'm going to say 40 something years. Fewer than 5% of them are associated with nurses. And so there's all these valuable, innovative opportunities being missed because nurses aren't getting engaged, even though I know they have what it takes to be innovators. So the next slide, please. The nurses have always been innovators. You might be thinking Florence Nightingale sitting on my shoulder here, or somebody else who has done something really awesome. But I think about all of us. So if Olivia hits enter here, you will see this perhaps familiar object in your world, the silent knife, a pill crusher. I don't know if a nurse invented this. I like to think that they a nurse did invent this, but it was an amazing invention. So I could sit there and crush my pills. If you have a patient with a tube or a patient who needs their pills put in pudding, this is a great invention. However, whenever I wanted to use it, it somehow sneakily got lost always. We could never find it on the unit. So what would we do? We would grab a bottle of mag citrate out of the Pyxis or the Omnicell, and then you would just use that to crush the pills. So here we are innovating every day just to find those workarounds. We are very creative, and although, yes, I work in an academic institution, and so I have access to resources that I didn't really have or I didn't know I had when I was a bedside nurse, but through being a participant in the ANA innovation work, I have learned of many nurse heroes, I consider them heroes now, who are nurses working at the bedside, who, when they asked, found the resources. And of course, the ANA innovation team is also here to help any of you who with your ideas. Next slide, please. So how did I get interested in innovation? It sort of felt inevitable. So there were problems that needed solving, and technology is everywhere, right? And so technology is used to solve problems. I was also, though, as a nurse, it was very important to me that we don't just develop things, gizmos and gadgets because they're cool. I wanted to develop things that solved problems, reduced health inequities without furthering a digital divide. I don't want to create things that aren't accessible to everybody. So those were just some things that I think are important from a nursing perspective, something that we bring, our nursing ethic, that is really valuable to this work. Next, and world. Next slide, please. So you might be thinking, I've got ideas, but I don't know how to invent something. Well, that was me too. I had ideas. I didn't know how to invent something. I came up with some ideas that I wanted to invent, and I had to ask around because lo and behold, I didn't know who invented things. I think there might be another click here, but I'm not sure. Or you can go to the next slide. So I had to ask around, and fortunately, people in my university who knew how these things happen told me about engineers, and engineers, lo and behold, they make things. I'm like, I actually, to be honest, didn't really know what engineers did. And in fact, it turns out engineers do a lot of things. There are mechanical engineers, there are nuclear engineers, chemical engineers, there are engineers doing all kinds of things, computer engineers. So I found that there were a group of engineers called biomedical engineers. And so they had some at my university. They like to build things. However, they don't necessarily know what needs to be built. They really wanted to partner with me because I had some ideas about things that needed to be built. And they were like, cool, show us what you need, and we will show you what is feasible, and let's try to make this happen. So I started forming partnerships. And when I talked to some of my colleagues in the ANA innovation work who are working in hospitals, for example, they learned from speaking to their supervisors and other people in their hospital that sometimes there's actually engineers working within their hospitals, or they could partner them with an engineer in a nearby academic setting. And so they're making that work happen, even though they might not necessarily have those tools right next door. Next slide, please. Okay, so I learned this about engineers, that they made things, and I found the biomedical engineers were the ones that I wanted. And then I also learned that there's different kinds of biomedical engineers. Who knew? So there's the ones that like to design things. There's the ones that like to evaluate things. There's the ones that like to test the user interface and how it looks and feels to people who are the end users, the people that are using the devices. And so there were biomedical engineers doing research. And so that was really interesting. I also learned that there were biomedical engineers who did hardware, so building the stuff, the objects, and biomedical engineers who did software. So they're the ones coding and making sure that the hardware and the software speak to each other and work together. So I had a steep learning curve when I started working with engineers. And I also learned that they might be motivated by different things than we are as nurses. Some are interested in helping humanity. Some are interested in getting a patent and becoming famous, making money, starting a business. Some just want to write publications. So it's important to find out as you get started. Don't just take the first group of engineers that you run into. Learn more about them and find out, do they have the same motivations as you do, or at least compatible motivations so that you can work together to achieve common goals. Next slide, please. Another interesting thing I found out that engineers have a process very similar to the nursing process. In fact, they ask a question, they do a little background research, they make hypotheses, they build things and test them, they analyze things, and then they go again. It's a circle, just like what we do in our nursing process. It's also, as a researcher, it was interesting for me to see that it also lines up very well with the scientific method. So after a while, all these processes are become very familiar and in alignment. So it helps when you can think about that when you're working with an engineer and saying, oh, this is very much like making a nursing diagnosis or evaluating what our outcomes were. And did this work, or do we need to go back and fix something and plan again? Next slide, please. So here's just a few examples of some of the things that I've worked on sort of to make it a little bit real. So in the upper left corner, you see a camera looking over at a bed with a little stuffed animal there who's simulating the patient that might be on that hospital exam table. And then behind that camera arm that is on an arm, you can see a screen. And so that is our telehealth cart. So I'm a forensic nurse by training and still practice as a forensic nurse. We wanted to build a telehealth sexual assault nurse examiner program, and we did get funding from the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, and also our state attorney general's office was interested in us becoming the statewide telehealth sexual assault nurse examiner program. But I wanted to build some equipment that was unique to the work that we do as forensic nurses, because there wasn't anything currently that really did that specialized care that we provide. So I worked with a team of engineers who were mainly hardware, biomedical engineers, and they helped put together and configure these, and then we tested it out. And then they had to get some software people outside of the university to help make the software talk with the hardware, and then we would test it out over and over and over again. We get our forensic nurses in there, and they say, no, I don't like the way this works. In fact, they said, I don't like this arm. And we had our standardized patients in there simulating the patient experience, and our survivor advocates, and they said, I don't like that arm. It looks like a scary spider. And the nurses said it shakes too much and it doesn't stretch around the bed enough. And so we changed, we pivoted, and we now have it on a rolling monopod with wheels. And so that's an example of how you innovate. You test it out, you engage end users in the experience, and then you reinvent. And then below that you see, it's not important that you see what's on there, but this is really this big algorithm with all the boxes and triangles and the star. This is something that a nurse, MSN forensic nursing student who I'm working with is developing as a tool to help forensic nurses learn which emergency contraception they should provide to a patient during a medical forensic exam based on their medical history and their needs and timing, et cetera, a bunch of different considerations. And I know that when I looked at this, I was like, okay, I do exams at 2 a.m. And I even tried like following, okay, this is yes, this is no, this is the, I don't think that I could make a lot of sense of this. Why don't you try digitizing this? She's like, what? So it's really cool. I have her for her MSN Forensic Nursing capstone. Now she's going to work with capstone computer science engineering students, and then they're going to do some interprofessional education and interprofessional practice on this project to digitize this and make it really easy for forensic nurses just to answer a question at a time and not have to think about all the different pathways. So hoping that will be a really nice tool. And then finally, the one on the right is one I'm developing right now. which is going to be, again, these are all solutions to problems, right? The solution to this problem that I was faced with was we do these great medical forensic exams, we provide awesome care, but then we don't know what happens to these patients afterwards. We're not set up as usually ER nurses to follow them in a follow-up clinic. We try to call them sometimes, but A, we don't have the time, and B, they don't answer their phones. So what if we could come up with a way to give them the information and support that they need in a timed manner, personalized to them and their needs through text messaging? So this is a text messaging platform that I'm building now with another engineering team, and he specializes in end users. So this is really important that we engaged an end user advisory board right from the beginning, sexual assault survivors and survivor advocates and forensic nurses. And I'll tell you, those sexual assault survivors hated the first messages that I came up with. They're like, no, that's triggering. No, don't say that. Don't do this. It turns out they wanted messages that provided information, but not too much information. And they wanted to choose the amount of information because it was overwhelming. They wanted things to feel personalized, and we wanted things to feel personal. We thought that would be helpful. But in the context of a recent violation of somebody's personal self, they didn't want things to be too intrusive. So we really modified those text messages. And again, including that end user is so important. So that's just 3 examples of things that seemed like technology was the inevitable solution to help solve some of the problems that I deal with as a forensic nurse. And do I have any more? Or is that it? I think I might be done. I just had a few tips. One is to check out the ANA Enterprise Innovation website. There are lots of guides there to help you get started. Looking for partners at academic engineering programs are good because oftentimes they are motivated by things that are not money and don't cost a lot of money. Like they want to do a project. They know how to get funding. They might want to just write pubs or be a part of something that could be potentially patentable. Connect with an innovation office. Your hospital might have one. Find a mentor, really important. They could probably hook you up with mentorship through the innovation work, and find a community. The ANA Innovation and being here tonight is part of that community. Explore funding options. The ANA has one. There are lots of options in your nursing organizations too. And lastly, just have fun because you're trying to work hard to find solutions that are ultimately going to help people, and it can also be a lot of fun. So I think that's all. I think I have it.
Wonderful, Nancy. Thank you so much. I just have a quick follow-up question. So you highlighted the engineering method along with the nursing process, and I was just wondering what have been some of the either similarities or differences that have really struck you between those two entities?
I think it really was, as I kind of alluded to, was the evaluation piece. I thought the engineers were just going to build the thing and then it was up to me to evaluate it, but it's really part of their process. And I found an engineer who that's really his specialty, to evaluate it from all the perspectives, from my perspective as a nurse using it, from the perspective of the patient using it, and then really, not just building it and leaving and saying goodbye, but being there alongside with each other as full partners, making those updates and improvements throughout the whole life of the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
At this time, we'll turn it over to Karen.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having us. And thank you, Nancy, for kicking us off. So I specifically put myself and my co-director, who's an engineer of the Center for Nursing and Engineering Innovation at the University of Massachusetts. So we'll talk a little bit about why we started and the work we're doing. So you can go ahead and advance it, please. So the Elaine Marup Center for Nursing and Engineering Innovation, really the purpose is to support formal and ongoing and deliberate collaborations between the disciplines of nursing and engineering. I actually just entered academia recently, only 5 years ago. Prior to that, my background in nursing was critical care, and where, of course, there's all kinds of stuff. And I was always interested in stuff and building stuff and how stuff worked, and really how stuff worked to support the patient, but not turn us into a technology center, but to really support the humanness. So to be used when it was needed, but even more importantly, to be taken away when it wasn't, which is not our specialty in critical care. So that led me to work with lots of companies, because back when I was in clinical, we didn't have quite as many rules and regulations. So we could really work more closely. And I kind of miss those days. Which led me to actually end up getting an invitation to work for a company, which turned out to be Philips Healthcare. And I really wasn't sure I wanted to do that. I honestly didn't know what I would do, but I was not in there very long before I realized, oh, wait a minute. Nurses are the largest profession in healthcare. We use more stuff than anybody else, yet we never get a voice at the table for how this stuff gets developed. So a lot of the things that we get handed that are there to help patients or to help our workflow don't have usability in mind in terms of the environment in which it's used. So I ended up staying in industry for over 25 years and then transferring to academia to really start to hopefully realize the nurse's role in product development. So hence we were able to start the center. We got some funding to start the Center for Nursing and Engineering Innovation to try to replicate the success that I had felt like I had within industries when we really put nurses and engineers together. And this is actually at our first annual symposium. So that's Frank, my co-director, who's like a foot and a half taller than I am. And then that's one of our local Congress people, Joanne Comerford, who kicked off. So not only Massachusetts is a real hub for healthcare innovation and has obviously a lot of healthcare strengths. And then so we have not only do we have a lot of support at the school, but we've got a lot of support throughout the state as well. And so our goal is really to build a center where we can co-train nurses and engineers, help them expect and realize a different future in healthcare innovation than they would have otherwise. And with any luck, serve as a model for other institutions who want to do it. So we don't want to keep it here. We would be thrilled if we saw it in as many places as possible. And in fact, I don't think I have this on the slides, but I'm actually going on a Fulbright faculty scholarship next semester in January to Edinburgh, Scotland, to work at a university there to do exactly that, to help them build their nurse engineer center. And then hopefully we'll have ongoing collaboration between our two institutions and allow for some international exchange with our students. Next slide, please. So the nurse engineer approach is pretty simple that we employ. We want to untap the unique insights of nurses and engineers to address healthcare challenges. And I think as Nancy alluded to, nurses have a lot of ideas, but often haven't been given the power or permission to innovate, nor is it typically part of our regular nursing training. Engineers have, they're trained innovators. They're so creative, but they don't often understand the operational limits or the operational needs at the lines of front care. So to get us together really makes 1 and 1 equal 5. So we want to forge new pathways in interdisciplinary research and education between nurses and engineers, and empower nurses and engineers to be healthcare innovation leaders. And we start with nursing and engineers, but really we are open to all interdisciplinary collaboration. Well, we see nurse engineers as the foundation, but certainly they're more of a beginning, not the end. And there's so many other disciplines that can and have contributed. So the overall goal of our center is to train the next generation of interdisciplinary healthcare leaders. Next slide, please. So the nurse engineer teams, again, we touch more products and services. I think I talked about this already. So really the ability to quickly and effectively develop and test, again, as Nancy mentioned, we have to test these and we have to do iterative testing. So you don't build the product till it's practically done and then get an end user to look at it. You build as many times along the product development cycle as you can. So when you have your first ideas, when you have your mock-up, user interface, when you have your mock-up early functionality, put it in the hands of end users. That's when you find that the arm doesn't work and you need to change it to a rolling stand. Because in terms of industry, you get a lot of experience because of what I've done. If it gets too far along the development cycle, you've run out of time and money to really go back and do that. And so we do multiple iterative product development here. And so the ability to quickly and effectively develop and test healthcare innovations really benefits enormously from doing it with nurse engineer teams. So next slide, please. So here's just an example of some of the stuff. So in our lab, we have 2 areas that we have really big, pretty robust programs of research. And this is the coolest thing. So this is, on the left is our healthcare robotics. And where do you think we are? We're in our nursing simulation laboratory in the nursing school. So Frank and most of those engineers that you see all have keys to the center, and we routinely use it. That's Stretch, our robot. Stretch has a gripper hand, and Stretch, we're working not only in the lab to test things, we actually have a whole wound care protocol. Because think about wound care in the hospital. A lot of times it has to be done by two people because you need one person to actually do the dressing, but the other person to hand the dressing supplies and help maintain the sterile field. Well, that's a perfect job for a robot because you really don't need two nurses. You need two sets of hands that know what's going on. So we're really working closely with Stretch and also with Bay State Health, which I'll talk about in a minute, to think about what makes sense for robots to do. We don't want to desensitize it, but let's not take advantage of current technology that can help nurses, especially with the nursing shortage. So we have a whole healthcare robotics research initiative, which is pretty well funded, which is led by Frank, Dr. Supp. And we have doctoral students and undergraduate students on those teams. And then on my side, I do a lot of work on improving the usability of IV smart pumps. So we take those for granted, but honestly, they don't work very well. And those of you who are delivering IV medications in the hospital know that the user interface is not particularly intuitive because most of the pumps in current use were developed decades ago and still are employing decades-old technology, which is not easy to use. It's not easy to back engineer for auto documentation, auto programming, and it doesn't actually deliver fluids very accurately, which is something we develop in our lab. So here we are, a bunch of nurses in the engineering lab, or the health sciences lab, where we have we have an IV smart pump testing lab and can run all kinds of programs there. So these two initiatives allow us to provide opportunities for students or other faculty that maybe don't have as much of an interest in their own idea, at least initially, but they want to start to get involved in healthcare innovation. So there's always lots of stuff for them to do and lots of opportunities. Okay, so next slide. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, the things I like to work on, not that I certainly have a healthy respect for research at any stage, but I really like to personally be involved in stuff that I can see having a difference at the point of care soon. So it's pretty proximate to where it can be used. So in order to do that, we do two things. All the stuff on the IV, both in our robotics and IV smart pump program, we actually take our observations from things that actually happen in real clinical settings, and then we mock them up in the lab and test them. And then the opposite happens is when we get to a certain point and we get some findings, to the extent that it's ethical and safe for patients, we like to see if we can replicate those same findings on real patients. So we have a wonderful working relationship with Bay State Medical Center, which is about 30 minutes down the road. And our innovation is completely bidirectional. So they give us ideas, we give them ideas. The ICU just gave me a brand new thing to test with a new product that they're having trouble with. So we're literally mocking that up in our lab, running exactly what they're doing in their clinical setting, and we can play with it as much as we want to give them an answer without being unsafe to any patients. And this is our nurse researcher at Bay State. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of some of the active projects we have. So we have Capstone, and I know, Nancy, you mentioned this. Every single semester, we use Capstone engineering students. So the engineering, both biomedical and mechanical, have Capstone projects in their senior year. So we put on the list a bunch of healthcare stuff, and it always gets picked up. So right now, for second semester, we have Capstone engineering students at Bay State looking at the problem of patient falls from a completely different perspective than nurses would look at it, employing systems engineering principles. We have the IV smart pump flow rate during actual clinical use that we're doing. We have a whole soup to nuts look at our whole pressure ulcer prevention program in the ICU, and including the products we're using, how we're using them, our SOPs, everything. Robotics we're employing there. We've surveyed the whole staff. We've tried some prototyping with Stretch. And then we also actually have a person on our team. This is completely different than Frank and my program. Who is actually an operations engineer, and he's literally working with the vice president of nursing, of the vice president of human resources, to look at nurse issues that impact nurse retention from all the exit interviews. So something completely different. And we want to support not just our two programs; those provide homes for people that maybe don't have an idea, but we want to support as many new ideas and support people that have completely different skill sets and interests than us. Next slide, please. And this is another cool one. This is the one. So this product right here, this little wire cage, very simple, was made and manufactured by Atrium Medical, who makes that particular chest drainage system. And it literally just clips onto the bottom of an IV pole. And so they have a very big thoracic surgery program at Bay State. So they have a lot of patients that they're trying to get out of bed and walk so they can do the early mobility, but they've got chest drainage systems. And the current systems are just not amenable to not tipping over during ambulation. Unfortunately, Atrium no longer makes this product. And so Bay State literally said to us, can you make us a product? So we went and found the patent. The patent is expired. So for some reason they let it go. So we have a team of capstone engineering students working with our nurses to see if we can actually design around the old expired patent, create a new patent, and also deliver some version of this product to Bay State. And we worked on it all summer. So we've gotten pretty far along. We have a second group of capstone engineering students working on it right now. And our goal is literally to do usability testing because it's a class 1 product and deliver a usable product to Bay State by the end of the year. And next, please. And it was developed, you can see, by a staff nurse, Brody. She's the one who said, please give us this. We had 40 at one point. Now we got 3. We need them. So what's some of the calls to action that, kind of came to mind as I was thinking about that? We really have to understand that the delivery of healthcare from a nursing perspective is so fundamentally important for healthcare innovation. So as nurses, recognize the value that you have, that your nursing knowledge has. It's certainly valuable to take care of patients, but it's really valuable too in helping innovate in healthcare. And it really takes a village. So to deliver meaningful improvements in healthcare really requires interdisciplinary collaboration. So while we have a lot of ideas and we know what might work, what won't work, and what some of the biggest problems are, we don't have all the skill sets that we need to actually make stuff happen. So we need our interdisciplinary colleagues. And there's many ways to engage in healthcare innovation. So this is just a couple more. And I know Nancy mentioned some too. So really start to look at your local clinical environment and see what needs to change. Partner with local organizations like UMass. Now we regularly have that's only a couple examples I gave. We regularly have nurses from Bay State giving us ideas about stuff they'd like to see developed. And we say yes to everything we possibly can. Work with the healthcare industry. It's gotten too far in terms of the conflict of interest stuff. I mean, I totally get that. You have to be ethical, but they need us and we need them. So we need to find better ways to work where what we're doing is transparent, but also collaborative so that they build the right stuff. And then obviously supporting other nurse innovators. So I think that was all I had. So the last slide, I think, just has true to our very close collaboration with Bay State. There's your Bay State annual nursing report, which has all the really exciting stuff that they're doing, including their collaboration with us. And then our annual report from 2022 has all the stuff that we've done a summary, as well as our very cool collaboration with Bay State. So that's a quick overview. Of course, I could talk for like 4 days, but I'll stop there. So thank you.
Karen, thank you so much. And just one follow-up question, if you don't mind sharing, what was your first project that you?
Well, it's funny. It's actually interesting. And probably many of you on the call might not even remember when AEDs were not a thing. Well, I was in the ICU at Miriam Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. The director of the ICU, the intensivist, happened to be very active in the American Heart Association. And we realized that and at that time, the response, because we all had just big defibrillators, and on the floors, there was one for every 2 or 3 floors. So response time, if you had a sudden cardiac arrest on a med-surg unit, was slower than the response time if you dropped on the street in the city of Seattle, because they had a very active EMS system. We're really doing stuff to optimize. And we're like, well, that doesn't seem right. What can we do? So we literally worked with Laerdal Medical at the time to design and create the first AED. And this was really funny. This is where the FDA sometimes is slow. So they wouldn't let us, it was actually semi-automatic, because they wouldn't let us design the first product without a screen. And we would say to them, do you realize that the people's hands that were putting this don't know how to read an ECG? But they could not get past it. So the very first AEDs were actually semi-automatic AEDs, which required you to look at the display that you didn't know how to read and then tell the machine to actually deliver the shock. But fortunately, that didn't last too long. The screens disappeared. They became fully automated. And the state of Rhode Island was the very first state to make an AED part of BLS. So that was really fun. And that was a long time ago.
Thank you so much for sharing. Wonderful. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dan.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate it. Nancy and Karen, you set a high bar, and I hope I'm going to be able to live up to it in my presentation here. This is inspired by a number of talks with my good friend Ken Dion, who's the current president of Sigma Theta Tau, and their organizational call to be bold. We've heard already tonight about technological applications of the nurse engineer. I'm going to move us into the space of also thinking about economics and conservation. Because while we can solve problems at the bedside, nurses are also really good at solving problems all the way out into the community. What I find as an engineer working with nurses is that nurses bring this tremendous capability to work from the bedside all the way out to the community. And the problem that I think we need to address collectively is the fact that we've got a disastrous, or what I'm calling a disastrous, medical care system. It's not that we're not doing a good job, but we really need to think about what is the economics and what is conservation for the planet and how does that play in. So get at the edge of your seats and get ready to move through a bunch of slides quickly. I'd ask you to throw in the chat when you see this next slide and you see these gorgeous sunsets. In one word, what would you do to describe your perfect sunset? So throw in the chat a word that describes a perfect sunset. Now, I do this with my students, nurses and engineers, all the time. And the word that comes up very, very common in mine on the next slide, you'll notice, is actually the word priceless. I hear a lot of people refer to it. Now, I'm looking at the words that are coming here in tranquil and peaceful, and those are really good. Maybe I'm dealing with less mature individuals when I'm asking my students. But priceless, one of these things that reflects a value. And that's interesting because when we look at value on the next slide, what we're thinking about is, what do you mean by value? If we were to look at that sunset, if we were to say that that sunset is priceless, is that really true? Is the sunset something that we have a tremendous amount of value? Would we give up all the graduations we could go to, or all the weddings we could attend, or all the celebrations of birth just to see one sunset? As we see on the next slide, actually, what we're not talking about is the value of priceless. What we mean is that the memory is more valuable than money. When we're talking about priceless, we're thinking about money and things, and those memories, those things are more valuable than money. So when we go to the next slide, what we mean here is actually not that we're looking at money and value of items, because obviously every memory is going to be more valuable than just a pile of bills. But in fact, on the next slide, what we'll notice is that it's actually the comparison of different experiences, different memories, different things we value. How do we value birth and weddings and honor death? Nurses are good at understanding that people have diverse values on these things. And so when we understand it on the next slide, what nurses are really good at in economics is understanding opportunity cost, which is defined as the loss of potential gain from one alternative when you pick something else. And so money is one way of measuring value. But money itself doesn't have any inherent value. In fact, we often lose value when we talk about money. Just think about actuarial analysis, the value of a human life as measured by insurance. Of course, that human life is much more valuable. But why is this a problem? When we look at the next slide, we see the issue that we're all struggling with. In the United States, our healthcare system, or what we might think of as our medical care system, is not providing value. We spend more and more and more money on a system with poorer and poorer and poorer returns. We have low life expectancy compared to peer nations, even though we're way outspending them. Why is this? As we explore on the next slide, a recent article, and there's plenty out there, but a recent one from Lance et al. Talks about that one of the problems is the perils of the medicalization of health. And I love the policy points that are here, and let's just reflect on them. Medicalization is a historical process by which personal, behavioral, and social issues are increasingly viewed through a biomedical lens. We diagnose and treat things. Medicalization in the United States has led to a conflation of health and healthcare and a confusion. The essential and important work of population health, public health, and health policy writ large is being thwarted by a medicalization view. And why is this? On the next slide, I would argue that part of it is how we define needs. When we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we think about meeting the needs at the base of the pyramid, physiological needs. But as there are more and more people on the planet, or as we take care of a more and more acute need, we end up spending more and more resource just staying at that physiological level. And we never address the more complex outcomes. So as we see on the next slide, what ends up happening is we imagine Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we apply our person-centered innovation, we think about leave no one behind, and we spread all of our innovation across physiological needs. I would actually argue, as we've got on the next slide, that we need to think more about population. And so when we look at our needs, maybe we need to think about them across the hierarchy of needs as opposed to just physiological. And of course, if we dump innovation in, like on the next slide, eventually we solve the problem. Or do we? Next slide, please. Actually, all that happens when we dump all that innovation in is we end up with a different problem. We have stripped the earth of its capacity to be able to support us as human beings because we're dumping everything into technological solutions for physiological needs. Now, I'm not saying that we're doing that on purpose or out of ignorance. I'm not blaming us for thinking about that, but I'm saying we've got to step back and look at the medical care system broadly and solve it as an entire system. And I think nursing is uniquely positioned to lead in this. On the next slide, you'll see a term that we define as STEMpathy. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math, right? And believe it or not, many folks consider nursing not part of that. And that makes no sense to me. I mean, nurses obviously know science. They obviously apply technology all the time. They're very quantitative. And as engineers, we've got all kinds of head value and hand value. But we often ignore the heart value. And nurses, of course, own that space as the most trusted profession. So yes, engineers can partner with nurses to make a better device or a better system. But how do we fix the American medical care system? How do we fix it so that we start saving lives, and to borrow a Johns Hopkins phrase, millions at a time? On the next slide, I'm going to start thinking about how we solve this. The U.S. National Science Foundation defines convergence research as having two characteristics: deep integration across disciplines. You'll notice I've got in bold new theories, new frameworks, new paradigms. And the research has to be driven by specific and compelling problems. On the next slide, we see what those look like. The problem that we need to address and the integration we need to have can be addressed in two ways. The integration is by the vanishing point. The vanishing point is something that artists use to make a two-dimensional picture appear to be three-dimensional. All parallel lines in the foreground vanish into a single point in the distance. The vanishing point, the future we all desire, is accomplished by parallel disciplines, nursing and engineering, working in the present to create the future we all want. And what problem do we need to solve? In the next slide, we come across a term that you should have heard about increasingly in the literature, the Anthropocene. This is the period of time that we live in, where human activity is the dominant force on the planet. It influences climate and environment, and it confronts humanity. We have to ask the question, how do we use technology to help us thrive when we are now living at the planetary boundary? And second, how do we have social contracts so that we promote justice and equity and diversity and inclusion? How do we make sure that the financial benefits that a few of us enjoy are spread so that individuals, families, and communities around the world can benefit from this? On the next slide, we'll see the way we've historically addressed these kinds of issues. We often think of I-shaped professionals, drilling down deeper in a discipline, right? So from the associate degree to the baccalaureate degree to the master's to the PhD, more and more knowledge in a specialty. One of the ways we can address the nurse engineer is in a T-shape. Let's take nursing and add things to it. Nursing plus policy, nursing plus business. Bev Malone and Patricia Yoderwise and I wrote an article where we described the benefits of I-shape and T-shape. And on the next slide, I want to share with you a quote from that article. In our opinion, the power of convergence, where deep interdisciplinary collaboration solves a pressing social challenge, it fundamentally includes the need to prevent the lessening of profession-specific content. We don't want to have indiscriminate blurring. The nurse engineer is not some new muddled thing where we mess up what it is to be a good nurse or we mess up what it is to be a good engineer. We need to keep disciplinary training. We believe that T-shaped practitioners are essential to the success of convergence because disciplines must be a priori defined and then transdisciplinary nature can be pursued. But how about this idea of a V-shape, a vanishing point? On the next slide, we'll discuss something that I put together with Mary Ellen Glasgow at Duquesne University on the concept of the nurse engineer as a V-shaped professional, taking the deep discipline of engineering, the deep discipline of nursing, and pointing them towards a common future of a sustainable humanity on the planet where all needs are met for all people at all times, as opposed to focusing on physiological needs, focusing exclusively in some domains. The goal here is meeting all needs of all times of all people. It's a bigger aspiration. And so when we see on the next slide, when Mary Ellen and I are working on this and we're taking this intersection of nursing and engineering, you'll notice a few things. We've moved from the dash between nursing and engineering to the plus between nursing and engineering. This was very intentional. We take the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of nursing, empathy, and assessment, and we look at what that produces. One of the things that comes out of nursing is phenomenal theory, as well as practice. We like to describe nurses as bending themselves to the problem through empathy. When we look at engineering, we look at the knowledge, skills, and attitudes, and we think of mathematics and models. Engineers tend to produce things. And engineers tend to bend the future to some solution through design. And so we see convergence or V-shape through a bending here. STEMpathy, applying science, technology, engineering, and math by also bending ourselves to understand the problems around us. The next slide has a nice summary quote that Mary Ellen and I put together of what the nurse engineer of the future looks like as a V-shaped professional. The nurse engineer works with comfort at the interface of the I-shaped discipline of nursing and the I-shaped discipline of engineering. The nurse engineer is at peace, working with the disquiet of the latent variable, the thing that one knows must be true, but cannot be evaluated directly and can only be studied from inference of its impact. The nurse engineer captures the known in a model, describes the perceived but not yet known, the known unknown in a theory, and accounts for true unknown unknowns in stochastic terms or using conservative safety factors. The nurse engineer moves effortlessly between the abstraction of mathematics and the full presence of empathy, because convergence of the disciplines of nursing and engineering into a single profession means that the abstract and the fully present coexist simultaneously for the purpose of generating a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. On the next slide, I just want to say thank you to nursing. As an engineer, I have learned tremendously from you. Thank you to ANA for inviting me here, to the profession of nursing, and to the many nurses with whom I've had the privilege of publishing articles on the nurse engineer. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dan. One follow-up question that I have before we'll start taking questions that are emerging in the chat, which is great, is that, can you further describe the importance of STEMpathy and that translation of STEMpathy and innovation?
It matters a lot of different ways. First of all, the fact that nursing is often excluded from the STEM acronym is catastrophic for some funding decisions. It has all kinds of implications. There might be some misogynistic reasons and historical reasons of why that's there. There might be having to do with licensure or having to do with visa status to bring people into the country. But I find it absolutely an atrocity that nursing is not considered a STEM discipline. It clearly is. And for me, the thing that makes it worse is when they tack an extra M on the end to call it STEM by adding medicine, as though medicine encompasses nursing. Nursing is its own profession, the largest profession in healthcare, and it needs to be treated as such and recognized for its nursing science and nursing policy and nursing practice, and bring that into STEM. And I think one of the things that nurses contribute, again, is that ability to bend themselves to the individual patient, the family, the community. And we would do a lot better job in our design work in STEM if we cared as much as nurses do.
Wonderfully stated. Thank you so much. So as questions are starting to populate in the chat, we want to have a nice, robust discussion. So please share those. And if we can start with a question from Kelly for Karen, are you training folks as dual degreed nurse engineers, and how will their work role differ from others on the team?
Well, I know that Duquesne has that program, and so we talk with them regularly about that. So the answer is yes. Of course, in academia, the wheels of change move slowly, but there is support for it. So a couple things. One, we've actually just developed, and it's been approved by the Faculty Senate, so hopefully we'll be able to go forward next fall for a certificate program in healthcare engineering, or healthcare innovation and entrepreneurship, that'll be open to all disciplines. But it'll be run out of our center just because it needs a home. So that's one thing. We've also we've put together the coursework for a 5-year degree, just like the one at Duquesne. And we have our actually first student doing it. So it's not an official sort of program, but we have one student who's kind of going through, and we've put together a curriculum so in 5 years, he was willing to do it for 5 years. He can meet both the engineering requirements and the nursing requirements. So we're working very closely. He happens to be biomedical engineering because we work with all the engineering discipline or whatever departments, but primarily for what we do mechanical and biomedical. And a little bit more electrical as well. And then, as you know, from Hari, we do organizational too. So there's really no limit, but you have to start somewhere. And so this biomedical engineer our plan is to graduate him with this curriculum in 5 years, and he's in his second year of it. So it's on the horizon for sure, but how long it'll take to be official, I'm not sure. Interestingly, I already have just this week got two emails from potential students in the area who know about our center and are looking for the program online, which of course it's not there. So I guess that's a good problem to have.
It's a good problem to have. Another follow-up question, is your institute doing any work with the FDA to change the methods for medical device clearance?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the IV smart pumps, we are really active and very pretty well widely known because nobody else is doing it. So the way the FDA works is most of the obviously they have their testing requirements for all different devices, but a lot of that comes from the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, which some of you may be members of or if not heard of it. So they have actually a bunch of task forces and committees on there. And one of them is the testing requirements for IV smart pumps. And so last year, in 2021, they developed some new testing requirements. Now they're voluntary at this time, sort of. Which puts a more clinical relevance into the testing program. So interestingly enough, the Alaris pump, for any of you who are in hospitals or use large volume pump, was on shipment hold for 3 years, from February of 2020 till it just got rebrought into the market July 22nd, I think. And the reason is they had so many safety problems that the FDA didn't want to pull them from the market, but they stopped them from expanding their footprint or selling any pumps until they fix these things. So when they came back into the market under the new TIR 101, whatever guidelines, their reported accuracy and with the exact same pump under the old guidelines was plus negative 5%. Their reported accuracy now across their flow rate range, which is 1 to 999, is negative 19% to 5.5%. So just by changing the testing standards, the accuracy has changed. Now, that being said, a lot of exactly what testing standards they use are not quite spelled out. So there's still some wiggle room. So I think as we get a little bit more stringent, we're going to just see these current pumps on the market fall short of anything that we would expect to be reasonable. That's just my personal opinion. So we continue to work at the let's make the testing clinically relevant, and then let the FDA require that for 510Ks. And we're just doing right now. It's only the smart pumps that we're working on, not any other stuff with the FDA.
Thank you, Karen. This is a great question for all three of you. So many nurses, and this is from Kelly, so many nurses reach out and ask if they should get an engineering degree. I'm not sure how to answer that. For most things, they can partner. But as Dan stated, if you want to create something new, should you give folks both lenses at once or a different one? Will dual training do that? So if we'll start with Dan, if the panel could answer that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. It partially depends on which systems we're talking about designing and building. So, for example, while the United States eliminated slavery with the Civil War, separate but equal existed for 100 years afterwards. And that's where we built our interstate road system. So we tore up our cities using separate but equal and baked segregation into all the concrete we poured. And so if you're wondering social determinants of health and thinking, how are people healthy or not, understanding how civil engineers build the billions of dollars of infrastructure that all of our lives depend on, and how that infrastructure affects our health is something that really moves us out into a community. And so I find that when I work with nurses, that what really helps is for me to pick up your language and for me to share with you my language. In other words, to translate the language across. I think there can be value in getting each degree. One of the things I'm proposing, though, is that we actually need to look at what it looks like for a future degree that's at this interface, right? I think truly what will emerge in whatever it is called in the future, but the person who has the skills of nurses and engineers and is working in a caring space of design of the future, I think will look very different than what we all look like in the current parallel present.
Thank you. Nancy?
Oh, I think it's a great conversation. I think Kelly's unique because, she started as an engineer, and so I only imagine the horror that she experiences when she goes to the bedside and sees, who made this thing? I can't use this. I think that's fabulous to have that lens. That it's a unique one because I don't personally want to get an engineering degree. I learn a lot from my engineering partners. I appreciate the lens that they have, the lens that I have, and I'm fascinated with that combined lens that future nurse engineers and nurses will have.
Thank you. Karen?
Well, first of all, I think there's room for both. So to kind of go on Nancy's comment, yet not every nurse wants to be an engineer, and certainly not every engineer, Daniel, probably wants to be a nurse also. So I think there's plenty of room for teaming, and we can have a lot of success there as long as there's mutual respect for our interdisciplinary expertise. On the other hand, Kelly and I have talked many times about actual nurse engineers and the incredible role they could play in a hospital. So, for example, we had a discussion, and Kelly and I have written several articles together for the AJN Innovation column. And one of the first things we talked about was when IV pumps started getting moved outside of the room and people were putting, 10 to 30 feet of tubing on them. There's a whole lot of things that does to IV flow. But that was the idea. That was the solution nurses came to. Well, Kelly came up, said, if we had a systems engineer look at it, maybe we could have brought the clean room to the patient. Just a completely different, rather than put extra tubing, she thought build like this clean room where you can basically kind of put a plastic thing into the room and then go still interact with the pump. So I think there's some real advantages to have the actual trained nurse engineers as a regular hospital job. Their whole job is to go around, look at stuff, and try to come up with new ways of doing things. And as a matter of fact, at our center, we keep a list of every actual nurse engineer that we can find in the country, which is a pretty short list right now. I'm sure we're missing some, but we're working with someone at Brigham and Women's Hospital who was a nurse first, went back and got her engineering degree, and literally works in the biomedical engineering department. And now we're working with Brigham and Women's on a project together that requires both nursing and engineering expertise. And Liz, the nurse engineer, is directing the project along with her engineer boss, supervisor at the hospital. So I think there's some room for everybody.
Wonderful.
One of the things, just to riff on that a little bit and looking at the question from Ken, so it's fascinating. So, so as an honorary fan, I tried to go back and assume that I could get an associate's degree in nursing and figure out like, hey, let's explore what it would be. And and not to beat folks up, but there is a very gatekeeping mindset, right? That somebody with a PhD that's worked with nurses for 15 years, that my real focus is to go back and take some, freshman level a psychology course, and I thought, not that I have a problem with it, and not that but it felt very much like, instead of, wow, it'd be really exciting to help train you up to be able to know nursing so that you could then do it as an engineer. It was almost more of an attitude of like, well, you'll be taking a slot in the education system from somebody that we need to be, working with us at the bedside, as opposed to this space that you're proposing to work in. And it was very enlightening to me to find out that would be kind of an attitude towards, and again, it's not pointing fingers, it was kind of surprising. So,
well, come to UMass, we'll train you, Dan, and we'll make it fun and relevant.
Be careful what you ask for. You might end up with an engineer there. So.
We'll even try to find funding for you.
I know a gentleman who, I think he was 60 or even 70, who was an architect who went to nursing school because he wanted to understand how to design nursing stations better. So this could cross many different professions.
Well, but engineers are just as bad. We have this vision that you can't possibly be an engineer unless you've taken a lot of calculus, right? I mean, and of course, it is useful for some branches of engineering to know calculus. But it's just one of those, it is a very gatekeepery kind of, well, if you can't do a differential equation, thou shalt not be an engineer. And it's, this goes to that notion of not blurring the disciplines. But I guess the question is,
should we have Justin make his
measuring blood pressure equal being a nurse, and does doing a differential equation equal being an engineer? So, it's quite interesting.
Posing the question from Ken, Karen, do you see any credentialing for RNs who will become dual role RN/BE?
I'm not sure I understand the question, so maybe it's because I'm not actually a nurse engineer. Credential, you mean engineering credentialing?
Ken, do you want to come off mute if you're
I'm sorry.
available? I just want to make sure I'm understanding too.
Yeah, I was thinking like, how critical nurses would have a CCRN or, I'm a CHRN hyperbarics or, EN emergency nurse.
Okay.
See any type of a credentialing organization regulating the training of nurse engineers and where they would belong, in a hospital or, in a engineering design firm working with, healthcare.
Actually, it's a great question. I've never really given it any thought, but I think if we ever get on a roll and get enough of these programs going, I think the credentialing will probably follow. Where would best belong? I really don't know. We need you nurse engineers to tell us.
Right. I agree with you, Karen, and I've worked in credentialing for 10 years. You're absolutely right.
Another question from the chat, from Robin. It's not just the FDA, it's also CMS and what they will and will not approve. So any reflections from Karen, Nancy, Dan on the aspect of CMS? Furthering
this is where we have different languages. I would have to Google CMS and nurse to be able to understand what it was, because I don't know.
I don't know if I can tell you a little bit of my experience with CMS, because I actually also have a pretty active program of research on non-ventilator hospital-acquired pneumonia prevention. And so we've been working with CMS for over a decade, but what our experience is they're a regulatory agency more for mandatory reporting and standards versus actual. I've never dealt with them directly about any sort of regulation of medical devices, but it's really testing standards, because we've been actively trying to get them to recognize it. Actually, just as an FYI, it's the number one hospital-acquired infection. That's by CDC prevalence testing that they do every few years. But it's divided around the hospital, so we're having a little trouble getting traction on it. So anyway, yeah, I don't know. I haven't had any direct experience with medical device regulation with CMS.
Thank
In
you.
fact, we haven't made much progress, period. Now that I think of it.
There's another question from Kelly. Bear with me. A question actually, first from Kenneth. Dan, how do we get industries to understand the value of RN engineers? When I bring this up in the healthcare leadership, they understand the potential, but can't see why they should hire dual role professionals.
Well, yeah, and that's a great question, Ken, right? I mean, it goes to the question, why do nurses appear in the room charge, right? I mean, the compensation reimbursement model is fundamentally broken. And so when we try to do expansion, and this was kind of where I was trying to go with my point, right? The more effort we pour into an obviously broken system, I don't think we're going to get out of it what we're hoping for. And so in my view, one of the alliances between nurses and engineers is to overturn the table on the broken medical care system that we suffer through in the United States. That's a fundamental problem. And then we can say, okay, now how do we turn that stuff over? But Ken, to your point, if certain professions in healthcare have an oversized voice in how we bill and how we compensate, then you're not going to overturn that. People are going to say, well, now if the nurse engineer comes in and is an incredible entrepreneur and actually does things that promote health, then more power to it. And, you'll be the Mark Zuckerberg that doesn't need to go to college to make $1 trillion. But, but if we're going to talk about in the space of students who go to college, who go into a professional space, the things that are broken in our medical care system are very serious.
Another question. Do you think we can use the new PCAST report to embed nurse and engineer partnerships at the bedside? Seems like a good opportunity. From Kelly. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Kelly, you've got me on Google again. So, I just went and read about CMS. Now I'm reading about the PCAST report.
I don't know what that is either.
Well, September 7th, 2023. She's on it.
If you're able to take yourself off mute.
Can you guys hear me? I don't know how good my connection is.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes,
Hi,
we
Kelly.
can.
Yeah, this report finally is recommending that they put some teeth behind patient safety and adverse outcomes and ongoing measurement and reporting. I mean, for a long time since the air was human, it was like, IHI came out and, the Agency for Healthcare Quality Research, but no translation. Then there was always talk of penalties, but this is a report, at least from my understanding, recommending that there is someone specifically responsible for it, which in my ears says measurements engineer, real-time process information. So I don't know. I think it's a great opportunity if you can get, the ear of these people. One of the people on the committee is a nurse, which I thought was a good start. But maybe the university folks would have better connections. The other people on the report are head of healthcare, engineering departments and things like that in their universities.
Great point.
Thank you for sharing that. Question from Tiffany Kelly. What types of nursing courses do the engineering students take to meet the nursing component of the degree? Great question.
So I know at Duquesne, it's essentially 2 baccalaureate degrees side by side, right? So that's hence the 5 years, because you basically peel off enough that there's some overlap, and that's basically it, because there's very little space in the engineering curriculum to give credit for clinicals, and minus the clinicals, there's no nursing degree, right? So that's kind of the current version. Now, some of the other places that have dual degree programs have a baccalaureate and a master's, right? A step process kind of thing. And that's a little bit different. There's pros and cons to each approach. I know from the standpoint of engineering, to be able to get an engineering license, it tends to be very gatekeepy around having a baccalaureate degree in engineering, unfortunately, because that's how state license bodies work. And nursing has some of its own challenges with state licensing bodies. So it really kind of depends if you're where you're trying to work and how you're trying to work. So.
Yeah, and I'll ditto that. Since we're basically replicating Duquesne's program, we're doing it exactly the same way. So it's 2 simultaneous baccalaureate degrees, and with a couple things that can satisfy electives for both, but there's not a ton of overlap for either. So it's a little tricky, and I think it's pretty impossible to do it in less than 5 years, and even that's hard.
Thank you. It's appreciative. Question for all three, and maybe if we can start with Nancy. What are some of the lessons you've learned along the way that would be helpful for other nurses who are interested in this space?
Well, lessons learned. I think just first of all, being curious is really important. So instead of cursing when you have a problem, think about what could a solution be, and then getting serious about talking to people about how we might address these solutions. I think another big lesson I learned that I should have backtracked on about working with engineers is that we did, in fact, switch teams at one point because one team was interested in building the prototype and moving on, building the prototype, maybe getting a patent and moving on. And we really needed a team that was going to be engaged in the sustainability of it. So, again, making sure that you're developing partnerships with that long range view would be another piece of advice.
Thank you. Dan?
So a lesson that I would share is that I put this in a recent paper, is that it's not apples to apples or oranges to oranges. They're different. You don't get a degree in engineering. You get a degree in civil engineering. You get a degree in electrical engineering. You get a degree in environmental engineering. You get a degree in nursing. You can then work in geriatric nursing or pediatric nursing. You see what I'm saying? And so it's not talking about one being good and one being bad. It just has to do with that little bit of flavor difference. And so while we think about them as 2 professions, the way I described it was thinking about it as a cluster of grapes and thinking about pieces inside of an orange, right? And the idea was that an orange represented nursing, and there were pieces inside it, but it was all part of that same orange. Versus the cluster of grapes where, yes, it's a group of grapes, but each grape is actually different, slightly larger. And the reason why I share that is because there is a huge difference in salaries, genders, interest in topics across the spectrum of engineering, from 5% female and highly paid for engineers in informatics and computer science to 52% female and the lowest paid engineering profession, mine, environmental engineering. And so it is interesting to think. So when you say engineer, it is not always the same thing. Not that when you say nurse, it's always the same thing. But the diversity in the different subdisciplines, which we would never call subdisciplines, we would simply say they're disciplines. Civil engineering is a discipline. Electrical engineering is a discipline. The difference among the disciplines in engineering is pretty diverse.
And I would just add a couple of things to that. So thank you both. Nurses should realize that the workarounds you all do every day, your colleagues are doing around, are really the raw material for innovation. We need to get out of hiding and create environments that don't slap our hand when we stand in front of the supply cart, pull 4 things together and nothing to do with what we're trying to make them do, duct tape them together and actually make them do something for the patient. That's literally a prototype. And nurses do that every day. So recognize that really is the raw material. And if you're having that problem on your med-surg unit or your cardiac unit or your whatever unit, chances are every cardiac unit in the country is having the same problem. Also, remember that there's so many different ways to apply your nursing knowledge. Then simply patient care, which of course is extremely important, but the whole infrastructure we create around patient care, I don't think there's anybody more qualified to figure out how to better make that work than nurses. And then be patient with yourself, be respectful of your both your strengths and your limitations, and know when we need help from other disciplines so that we literally can make 1 + 1 = 5. Those are some of the things that come to mind.
Just looking at the chat to see if there's any other questions. I guess I'd like to just pose one other question that's very broad, but the title of this lounge was Nurse Engineers Building What Healthcare Really Needs. And I'd like to just ask you, from the standpoint of that nurse engineering lens, in your opinion, what does healthcare really need right now?
To throw out the way we're working and fix it. Because we're not doing healthcare, we're doing medicine, and we're pouring all of our resources into diagnosing and treating individual illness, as opposed to considering people and their families and the populations and community context that they're in. And nursing is really good at considering it more broadly. And nursing needs to be leading what we do for health and wellness in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that one, but just adding a little bit to that is just I think how I started out talking about it was solutions that address human problems that don't increase the disparities. So as we build these techs, these devices, these medications, they become inaccessible to so many people because they're so costly. And so if we can look at innovations that really lessen that divide and improve access to care for all people, to improve not just their health, but their whole quality of life. I just add that to the similar discussion.
Yeah, and we need basically we need operational efficiencies. Healthcare is so incredibly inefficient. So just generally better ways of doing things, and that really impact patient safety. We like to concentrate not just on doing what it is we think needs to be done that's been identified by frontline caregivers, not us. We have a healthy respect for their perspective. But also, we need to do the clinical outcomes research to test whether what we did or changed or built actually works. And we need to be honest about it. I actually came up with my very first product prototype, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. And I did my own usability testing at Northeastern while I was there, and I flunked huge. And this is bias testing because I'm running it. So I had to decide, do I give this up, or do I really try to pretend like the results are different? Because it's a little tough when you realize your idea is horrible. It doesn't work. You missed every mark. So I left ejected, actually, and I happened to be going to the innovation conference at OSU. And I ran into someone called Lindsay Roddy, who some of you probably know on this call. I know some of you do. And Lindsay was working on the same problem, only she had a way broader view, and her solution like 4,000 times better than mine. So I said, well, forget mine. I'm joining Team Lindsay. So we've been working together ever since, and Lindsay has done a phenomenal job. And I think she did 14 prototypes before the final product that she released. She's actually selling it and putting it into hospitals right now, and hopefully, and is building a company and idea around it. So you have to be passionate, but you also have to be really honest with yourself, because there's a lot of ideas you'll come up with that for one reason or another just aren't going to work. So be honest about that. And if it fails, just try to fail as cheaply and as fast as you can. So don't take something to the nth degree just because you thought it was a good idea. So listen to good clinical data and usability testing from end users.
I would piggyback on that and say, yes, definitely. It's okay to fail. It's part of the process. And also that I started getting a little nervous, because when I started down this innovation path, people were telling me, okay, now you got to start a company and you got to become a businesswoman and entrepreneur. I don't want to do that. So know that that's not required. You could just build things and help people build things, and you don't necessarily have to take on this whole new persona and this whole new career. So that was a little less intimidating for me when it said, hey, you could just do this as research. If that's what you really like to do, you don't have to start a company.
Mm-hmm.
one of my big innovation heroes is Abby Hess. I don't know if any of you have heard from her. She may have spoken on this Innovation Lounge before, but so she's a bedside nurse, and she noticed this problem, right, of children who were, when they were given anesthesia, they were scared of the mask. And as a nurse, she didn't just notice that they were scared of the mask, but she also noticed that children who were more scared and more distressed tended to not do as well postoperatively. So it's not just noticing a problem, but noticing how that problem impacts, down the road health. And so she worked on an innovation to sort of gamify that mask so that children are less afraid of it, and then they end up having better health outcomes. So really just that nursing lens and being able to see that whole patient holistic experience is really valuable. And you all have that. You all have that ability.
You all have that right now. Yeah, we've actually filed our first patent already from the center, and that's exactly what Nancy said. We're not starting a company. We want to spin out the IP, give it to somebody else to manufacture, and hopefully take some of the revenue back to UMass that then can support can support the center and other researchers for future innovative products. If it succeeds.
Well, thank you all so much. I just have to share one of the messages in the chat. Your geniusness comes through. So for all of for Dan and Nancy and Karen, thank you so much.